The following question was sent to me. Once you start throwing plugins on a stereo out or master out, you are pretty much mastering the project? Yes or no? I'm gonna answer that question, but first, the intro. Hey, what's going on? Chris here from MIXDOWN Online. Now, if you're new here on the channel, subscribe and click that notification bell. And again, guys, like and share this video. All right, so let's jump in. Now, adding processing on the master bus, is that considered mastering? Now, this is open for debate. Some will argue that it is mastering and some will argue that it's not. I'm more in the camp that it's not, but that depends on the purpose you have on adding processing on the mix bus. Let me explain. If adding processing on the mix bus improves your sound or is part of your sound and your tone, this, in my book anyways, is not mastering. Now, if we're talking about loudness, we're talking about bringing your mix to a commercial level, now this is more mastering. It's more a job for a mastering engineer. Now that doesn't mean that the mastering engineer will only work on loudness. Of course not. The mastering engineer will also do some frequency correction if needed. In this case, now this is mastering. So this is a bit of a difference between the two and the way I see processing on the mix bus. Now, I'm gonna show you what I have on my mix bus because this is also a question that I got last week. So let's jump in CUBASE. First, in my session, every time I load a mix, I load my mix template. My mix bus, I have like plugins that I usually use on my mix bus, but I don't necessarily use them all. So it will depend on the mix I'm working on. So by default, in my template, everything is bypassed. So first on top, what I do like to mix into is the console emulation from Sonimus, the Britson bus, which is a cool console emulation that emulates a Neve console. It sounds pretty good. And then what I do use during mixing as well is my Tegler Crème stereo bus compressor, which is a hardware unit. And I really love this compressor. And I use it on, I would say, 90% of my mixes now. So it is part of my workflow. And I love mixing into compression. Now, when it comes to compression, I don't compress a lot on the mix bus. I tend to stay around 2 dBs of gain reduction. Now, I'm going to show you my settings that I have on the Tegler. Which is, like for this one, we have the compressor at the bottom of the unit, and on top we have an EQ, which is a Pultec type EQ that I bypass most of the time when I start the mix. So I don't apply any EQ when I start up mixing. I just do that afterwards, after I'm done with my mix. I'm going to talk to you about that later on. But now what I need to focus on to start with is my compressor. So I have like a starting setting that I like to use, which is a fast release, a slow attack. And I tend to set up my threshold so I get around 1 to 2 dBs of gain reduction with a ratio of a 2:1 and sometimes 1.5:1. So very gentle stuff going on, just to be able to swim into the compression while I mix. And I kind of like that, just to glue things together right away and to be used to mix into compression, which doesn't necessarily work for everyone. It's not all mixers that will mix into compression, but you have to try it out. This is something that you need to decide on your own if that works for you or not. It's not something that you absolutely need to do. Actually, none of what I'm going to be showing you today are mandatory, okay? This is the way I work and this is the way I like to do stuff when I mix. Find your own thing, find your own chain processing, whether you use some or not, that doesn't matter. So what I have on my compressor, my stereo bus compressor, is simply a 2:1 ratio. And sometimes I go down to 1.5:1. And I keep my gain reduction to a 2 dB of gain reduction and not more than that, usually. So sometimes maybe a peak at 4, but If that happens, I usually have a ratio down to 1.5 if I want to have a bit more of gain reduction. But if I have a 2-for-1 ratio, I keep it at around 2 dBs of gain reduction. Now, as far as the attack and release, now you can experiment with that. On my side, I start with a slow attack, fast release, and then I'm going to work with the release setting. That will depend on the mix. While mixing a rock, I tend to go towards a faster release, or else maybe a kind of a automatic release also can work well. So those settings are for you to experiment with. And the top of that unit is an EQ, and I bypass that EQ when I start my mix. I'm going to add some at the end of the mix, and I usually start by adding a bit of a high boost, just to add a bit of top end to the entire mix. And I kind of like what it does, especially with this unit. The top end on this unit is very, very smooth. And this is something I like about the crème, which is quite nice, actually. So let's have a quick listen now that my mix is done. I'm going to have you listen to it before and after with the EQ. Now, something you need to pay attention when mixing in compression is always to look at the gain reduction throughout the mix. Now, I'm always aiming for a couple of dB of gain reduction. The more I'm going to add processing on my individual tracks, the more volume I can get at the end of my chain, and that can add up on my compressor. So I just need to monitor once in a while, look at the amount of gain reduction that I have on my compressor, just to make sure I stay at around 2 dB of gain reduction, so I don't overcompress the mix bus while I mix. Right after this, once I'm done with my compression, I do my mix. I start by the bottom. I'm not a big fan of top-down mixing. I tried it before. Not my thing. When I talk about top-down mixing, I mean that you start with your mix bus, you do your processing on the mix bus, and then you go down with the instrument mix buses, and then you finish out with your tracks. This is called top-down mixing. There's probably another term used to describe this technique, but this is not a thing that I like a lot. On my side, it doesn't work for me at all. It might work for you, but it doesn't work for me. So after this point, after I'm done with my compression, I just go down and start mixing my drums and so on, and focus a lot on individual tracks before getting into the instrument buses that I do stuff a bit on if I need to. Then I'm going to go back to my mix bus and tweak some stuff just to enhance the entire mix and glue things together a bit. But know that every move that you do on the mix bus is going to make a difference on the entire mix. And sometimes this will be a good thing, but some other times it can be a bad thing. So you just need to keep that in mind when working on the mix bus. Next, what I have on my chain is an EQ that I just don't use. And sometimes I do. But I keep it very gentle. It's very subtle moves that I do on all plugins that I have on my big mix bus anyways are all subtle moves using those plugins. And that applies to this plugin as well. So, for example, for this mix, I just added a bit of dynamic EQ on the mid-range, and that's it. Maybe by 1 or a couple of dBs, not more than that. Then what I have is an imager, a stereo width imager. I use that Brainworks BX V3 that I like a lot. You can do a lot of stuff with that plugin. Very good for mastering, actually. But for this mix, I just use the stereo width, which is very, very transparent. I'm not a big fan of stereo width plugins usually. It tends to mess up with the phase and stuff. It's kind of doing something weird. But this one is pretty transparent. Actually, you know what? I'm going to have you listen to what that does. I'm going to bypass it, and let's bring it on right after. Okay, very subtle. You know, it just opens up the mix a bit more, but that's it. Nothing too fancy, nothing too extreme, just the right amount of imaging, I would say. So this is not something that I'm afraid to use if I feel like using one, if I feel that it's going to help the mix itself. Then what I like to use as well, if I need to. I love the UAD Ampex, which is a tape emulation plugin. And I kind of tweaked a setting that kind of worked for me that I save as a preset and I always use. So I don't even know what I did, but it just works well. And this is part of my sound, I guess. So let me have you listen to what that sounds like. Okay, so I love what it does to the tone of the mix, and this is why I use it. But it happens that I just don't use it because I just don't need to, or it just doesn't fit well with my mix. Then I have a limiter. Now, this is only for having clients to listen to the mix louder. Most of the time when I send a mix to a client, they love to compare that to commercial mixes, so they love to have a loud mix. And I'm going to use a limiter, the Pro L from FabFilter, which is a very good limiter, that I use just to bring that to level and to send that to my clients. And I use it also during the mix. Once in a while, I'm just going to pop on the limiter just to have an idea of what my mix is going to sound like when mastered. But I bypass that plugin when I bounce for mastering, and this is something that I do all the time. I don't keep a limiter on while I bounce for mastering. Now, if the limiter is part of your tone, okay, and you're just not using it to bring up the level, but you just want to tweak the peaks and stuff with the limiter, there's nothing wrong with that, per se. If that is part of the tone of your mix, sure, okay. It's not something I do, but I've seen people doing so, and it worked well. But again, it's not something that I do on my side. Now, the important thing with the mix bus, every move that you're going to do on the mix bus will show throughout the entire mix. And again, like I was saying, it could be a good thing or a bad thing. Sometimes on my side, if I end up having to add or cut some frequencies a lot, okay, let's say I have to cut like more than 4 or 5 dBs in the mid-range, for example, first thing I'm going to ask myself is, okay, maybe I have a problem somewhere else and the mix bus is not the problem. So I need to go down the chain to check what's going on. It could be the instrument bus that I need to work on, but most of the time it's going to be on individual tracks. So that's why I add all of my EQ stuff and all of those types of processing at the end of my mix. I want to make sure I mix the entire track, the entire song correctly to my taste, and then just tweak out the last 5% of my mix with some processing on the mix bus. When that is done and I still have a problem of somehow that needs a bit more care, I just need to go back into my individual tracks and work that part out. And sometimes I just need to go and tweak the instrument buses that I do again after I'm done mixing all the individual tracks. Again, there's no rules. You can add compression, EQ, saturation, imaging, so experiment with stuff. Be careful. If you have to tweak too much, go down and fix what's at the bottom at the individual tracks stage, okay? If you have any comments or questions, or if you want to leave, what are your thoughts on the mix bus and what you use on your mix bus, leave everything down below in the comment section, and don't forget to share, to like, and to subscribe to this channel if you're new here on the channel. All right, guys, I'll see you soon.